I have been dismayed for some years, particularly when I was in the Ministry of Education, with the declining output of our researchers, generally speaking. And it's good to know that there is a reversal of the trend here. We have often said account for 17.5% of the world's brains. Why is it that we account for only 2.7% of the world's research output? It's particularly frustrating when we realize that that a lot of the work that could be done has in fact migrated to other countries where Indian brains are being applied elsewhere. But even then, we still have 17.5% in this country of the global population, and we ought to be doing much more. At a time when global challenges have been mounting and evolving in terms of their scale, their complexity, India has sadly lagged behind other nations when it comes to encouraging and investing in research, whether in the universities or in the marketplace. In fact, we currently spend less than 1% of our GDP on research and development, compared to 2.9% of a much larger GDP in the US, 2% of a much larger GDP in China, 4.5% of a smaller GDP in Israel. But if you look at the priority that we're giving, being below 1% is really sad. In fact, a recent UNESCO report has called out India's abysmal performance as being unsatisfactory, pointing out that the ratio of our gross domestic expenditure on research to overall GDP is one of the lowest in the world amongst similar countries. For example, we are the lowest amongst the BRICS countries. Now, we're all equally to blame for this. Governments certainly have not made enough of an effort to increase investment in research. Our current government in the centre has been accused of stifling academic freedom and inquiry on our campuses, which also discourages research. There's fundamental problems of what you do to create a vibrant research ecosystem. And on top of that, the private sector has not fully realized its role as an important facilitator of research and innovation. And one of the areas that I've been banging on about for some years is the need for linkages between universities and colleges on the one hand and private sector corporations on the other that could foster a mutually beneficial approach towards innovation. When we were in government, we got a study from Mr. Narayana Murthy of Infosys on the academia-industry interface. And he had a number of suggestions which sadly appear to have been shelved at the official level. But I'm glad to see, in this case, if Kerala University is actually going to develop some medical products which can be manufactured by companies and put in the market, and Kerala University can get a significant royalty out of it, why not? That's the kind of thing that happens routinely in the Western world and doesn't happen enough in our country. There's an absence of incentives, whether it's investments from the government or support from the private sector, and that has led to a decline in the culture of research in many of our campuses in recent times. And our students inevitably find themselves more focused towards the immediate needs of finding employment and responding to the incentives provided by the marketplace rather than by the joys of research. So congratulations to all of those who came up with the idea of a Researchers' Fest, because I would argue that nowhere is this more needed than in India. Now, I've not been asked to speak to you about research, so that was just by way of a preliminary introduction. I was asked to speak about the future of higher education, and it's a subject that's been quite dear to my heart, because frankly, the subject is one which is so vast. It goes to the core of what universities should be all about and which direction we should be heading in India. I'm not going to delve into the intricacies of the new education policy. I'm sure many of you have thoughts and views on that. I would rather keep the argument at a more conceptual or a general level, because there's no question that while the pandemic unleashed a turbulent period for our educational institutions and for the student community, including the challenges of the digital divide, uncertainty surrounding examinations, losses in learning outcomes, and all of that, we know that we can't blame the pandemic for everything that is wrong or inadequate with our university system. But there is no denying that there are a number of existing and recent trends we have to acknowledge. The global trend of slashing support, state support for universities, reduced allocations for research and innovation, which I've already mentioned, the quality of output, generally speaking, often going down. In India, particularly, the over-bureaucratization of academia and over-regulation on campuses, and of course, recently, the growing threats to the freedom of academic expression. All of these are part of the background to us looking at the future of higher education in our country today. But to do that, we also need to go to the past. And that is a whole debate about the idea of a university. It's a phrase, the idea of a university, that was famously associated with a 2-volume collection of essays with that title by Cardinal Newman, first published in 1852. Now, the idea of a university in which teaching and research were combined in the search for impartial truth was what was the ideal in the 19th century. And it reached classic form in Germany in the 19th century, the famous Humboldt model, which many of you may be aware of, which became the dominant global model of the university, a place with intellectual and academic freedom, university autonomy, the growth of independent disciplines with their own standards and priorities, and internationalism. And that was the model that really emerged from the notion of the idea of a university. Now, don't forget, of course, someone like Cardinal Newman was thinking principally in terms of religious education. And that is a very old tradition. Ultimately, for example, we proudly speak of Nalanda, but we must not forget that Nalanda was a religious university. It was a university of Buddhism. It attracted students from all over the world and it taught other subjects as well, but it was a religious university. And many of the great universities of the world earlier were also founded for religious purposes initially. Oxford and Cambridge were meant to advance Christianity. And this is simply the transformation we've seen since the mid-19th century to today is the transformation into the modern-day university as an intellectual and liberal engine for contemporary society, intended to serve as a haven for a community of thinkers for whom the cultivation of the intellect could be reasonably pursued for its own sake. And this was, that last phrase is actually Cardinal Newman's. And his powerful arguments for the value of a liberal education and the principles of university still are worth looking to for inspiration. To Cardinal Newman, the purpose of education was not to be merely preoccupied with the gathering of knowledge, wisdom, or scientific temper, but one that was motivated by the cultivation of a certain universal knowledge that aided, and I'm quoting him, the enlargement of the mind. Now, what would this imply for the university? The Cardinal believed, as a matter of history, the business of a university is to make intellectual culture its focus, its direct scope. Just as the work, and I'm using his example, just as the work of a hospital lies in healing the sick or the wounded, riding school teachers riding, or fencing school teachers fencing, a gymnasium helps you to exercise the limbs, the almshouse aids and solaces the poor, but a penitentiary restores the guilty. And just like that, the university cultivates the mind, the intellect. That is the logic. Now, this is not what many of us here in India think of as the purpose of a university, which is to go and get ourselves a job. The utilitarian approach to education as a tool for economic and social progress, which has naturally been criticized by many, and there's certainly merit in recognizing that these Newman essays and arguments were published at a time when universities remain the playing fields for those with the social, political, and evangelical capital, or roughly those who either belong to the gentry or to the church. In India, too, the best universities were still seen mainly in terms of social privilege, unconnected to the real world of economic opportunities, until fairly recently. You went to the university to get a degree because it was a thing you were expected to do. Job and career and so on were meant to follow. There was no real allowance in the Newman concept for polytechnics, vocational education. Indeed, there's very little there about the practical, employable skills that many of us look to higher education to give us. And it privileges the whole notion of the university as the ultimate ivory tower, where you sit there and you think your own thoughts and you contemplate the infinite and the absolute, but you don't really put your feet on the ground. How do you strike a balance between pursuing knowledge for its own sake and giving students saleable skills? And of course, how do you pay for the whole enterprise? These are all questions that go to the heart of education policy. Now, demands for even research to be economically and socially relevant and to help students to find work in the real world are widespread. And certainly when I reacted to the tour I was given today, my mind immediately moved towards commercial applications for some of the research. But what policies should you pursue to preserve democratic access? To preserve democratic access to the highest quality of education and to match individual talent to intellectual aspirations, as well as social needs. Universities are coping with various demands. Students want impressive qualifications, employers want usable skills, the economy needs innovation and ideas. But most universities in our country are set up in the classic mold. They operate in the realms of values and culture. They're often more concerned about political issues than market conditions. Now, most of you come from families that want you to translate your education into a decent salary. That's normal. And what's particularly normal about that is ours is a country where education has been a means to both social and economic advancement for many people. The difference between being condemned to poverty and finding a life of decency has often been education itself for many families. And if you look at the journey of Indian education since 1947, let's not forget the British left us with only 16% literacy in this country. In fact, I'm glad to see so many women in the audience. In 1947, only 8.8% of Indian women were literate. 8.8%. So you're talking about a dramatic transformation since then. We had barely 30 universities in 1947. We had about 700 colleges with an enrollment of just 4 lakh students. So we had to struggle in many ways to cope with the inadequacy of our higher education infrastructure at a time when we were the poorest, most illiterate, most malnourished, and least gender sensitive major country in the world, with over half the world's illiterate adults for much of that time, and over 40% of the world's out-of-school children. That percentage, unfortunately, has not gone down enough. Now, we did have a vision, going back to Jawaharlal Nehru, to systematically build up a very large system of higher education and create a large pool of men and women equipped with robust scientific and technological capabilities, but also with sensitive humanist and philosophical thought and profound creativity. And with all of this, we tried to go for a couple of E's. The catechism of Indian education was E for expansion, increase the number of colleges, institutions, courses, and so on. E for equity, give access to people who had been historically excluded from education because of their caste, perhaps their religion, their gender, their status as tribals, whatever, all of these things. We didn't, in the process of focusing on those 2 E's, we didn't focus enough on a third E, which was excellence. Too many of our institutions were not doing terribly well, and we had a few institutions of excellence that were islands of excellence in the sea of mediocrity. Yet there have been transformations, there's no doubt about it. Today the Americans speak of the IITs with the reverence they used to accord to an MIT. And the image of India has changed in the eyes of many people in the world from that of a backward developing country to a sophisticated land that produces engineers and computer experts. In fact, if anything, there is a stereotype the other way, because the old stereotype of Indians was that of snake charmers and sadhus or fakirs lying on beds of nails. Now every Indian is assumed to be a software guru or a computer geek. I was accosted at a European airport by a profusely sweating European saying, "Oh, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop?" I said, "I studied history, sorry." But the truth is that is now the expectation around the world. But when I see all the young students here, I must say I'm so pleased for them because when I think of how few were the options available to us in our college days in the 60s or 70s, as compared to the plethora of opportunities available to graduating youngsters today. There's no question that there are many more opportunities to study, wider employment possibilities to prepare ourselves for, many more subjects to pursue, and of course, there's even the phenomenon of on-campus recruitments from companies, which never happened in my time, nor did we have some of the professions that didn't exist in my time that are now available to all of you. And of course, we're keeping up with the world. There's progress in every area. I saw the research gallery here, but for example, the way in which now there are certificate programs in artificial intelligence and much machine learning that are coming up. IIT Madras has set up an online course on artificial intelligence. We are suddenly trying to keep up. Even if our universities are slow to change their formal syllabi, they're still trying to keep up with what's happening in the rest of the world. Now, in addition to those three E's of expansion, equity, and excellence, there is a fourth E that we can't get away from, and that's employability. Because in the real world, people have to have a job, have to have an income, have to be able to support themselves, lead a decent life, and be able to dream of a better life for their children. And that means a particular challenge for India's universities. Because one thing that I noticed when I was minister, and it hasn't changed in my view, is a systematic problem of skill mismatch between qualifications and jobs undertaken. I remember just a few years ago there was an advertisement in Madhya Pradesh for 14,000 constable posts. Now, constable post I think requires essentially just a high school pass out. That's all you want from a constable. The department received 9 lakh candidates for those 14,000 jobs, including 10,000 engineering graduates, a dozen PhDs, 1,90,000 regular graduates, and 15,000 MA and postgraduate holders. Now, there are more and more examples of this for every small-time menial job advertised in the country. Railways advertise track maintenance, qualified engineers are applying. These are people who just walk up and down the lines making sure there are no cracks. The problem is we are giving people qualifications that they cannot find jobs with. And it's partially because, of course, we are releasing graduates into an ecosystem that does not know how to use them. And the organization I head in the Congress Party, the All India Professionals Congress, did a survey in Kerala of engineering graduates and found 66% of them today who have jobs are in jobs that do not require an engineering degree. So we're churning out engineers in large numbers, but not qualifying them to work in the real areas that qualified engineers are required in today. And so they're ending up in jobs that didn't require the degree they wanted. And no wonder that 10,000 of them in Madhya Pradesh were willing to settle for a constable post rather than frying pakodas, which is the alternative that our respected Prime Minister has advised them to pursue. So even if I am speaking to you as somebody who has benefited from a liberal education right from my schooling through to my time in university, I can understand the desire of families and students themselves to make their higher education more utilitarian, to link it to the needs of what we once again want to be a rapidly growing economy in a globalizing world. And we've got our unemployment at record levels. 2 years ago, we had the highest unemployment figures ever recorded in all the years that numbers have been kept for unemployment. And there's no question in my mind that economics cannot be ignored in discussing the future of education. Now, I do want to say that if you were to look at the future, as we must, it is partially arguable, and I had been making this argument, that universities at core should be able to equip you for any job that you might get. Now, obviously, that excludes really specialized jobs. But most other jobs today require people with attitudes and habits of mind rather than with specialized knowledge in subjects that may no longer be relevant or may be out of date in terms of today's technology. I keep telling teachers, do not teach the children what to think, teach them how to think. And the reason I do that is the fact that, the era where we used to use education to have produce well-filled minds, that era was already out of date when I was in university. It's completely out of date today. You don't need a well-filled mind, because in the real world, any fact you've forgotten, any date you don't remember, any figure, any algorithm, any calculation, you can get with 2 clicks of a mouse or indeed on your mobile phone. So you don't actually need a well-filled mind. What you need is a well-formed mind. And a well-formed mind is one that actually addresses the world, that looks at complicated, unfamiliar problems you've never seen before, but knows how to approach them. You've never seen the problem before. Perhaps it's in a field or a job that didn't exist. As I said, the Oxford Martin School study says that in 2030, 30% of the jobs in the world will be jobs that don't exist today. And you can't prepare for a job that doesn't exist today except by knowing how to approach the unfamiliar. And that's where liberal education is quite useful, right? In some ways, one of the deficiencies of our engineering education, I know that that's not Kerala University's particular problem, is that it has trained people inadequately in terms of 21st century technology, but trained them to think in terms of absolutes and non-negotiable principles. This works, this doesn't work. This switch turns off, this turns on. There's only one way of doing things and no other. The problem is that is not the healthy way to look at the world. In fact, there was another Oxford study of all those associated with terrorist incidents between 1990 and 2005. 95% of the terrorists were engineers. Now, I'm not saying that all engineers are terrorists, but it's rather worrying that all terrorists or many terrorists are engineers. And the reason is very simple. It's the black and white view. Things can only work in a particular way, and you apply that to religion, you apply that to society. There is only one truth, only one way of doing things. Anybody who doesn't follow us, we must go and destroy them. That kind of thinking is extremely worrying, and it seems to me that we must have graduates who are rooted in habits of thought that are more flexible, more open, more appreciative of nuance, and more ready to go ahead and face what the world is going to offer them. I've often said that the human mind is like a parachute. It functions best when it's open. And just as you don't want to jump off a plane with a closed parachute, or that one that stays closed, you don't want to navigate the world with a mind that stays closed. You absolutely must have a different approach to all of this. Now, to my mind, if we can use universities to teach students how to make the new understandable, how to bring the distant near, how to make the unfamiliar into something that they can handle, they can understand, analyze, then they will actually be able to do much more than the world of certitudes and immovable, unnegotiable facts that education used to be all about. I do want to say that that is not an argument for moving away from either specialization where required, technical education where essential, scientific research where it can be practiced, but also, in very many ways, it is not an argument for trying to bring humanities and liberal thinking down to the crudest forms that some have been advocating. To my mind, there is absolutely no excuse for creating an education system that produces more effective white-collar workers rather than producing deep-rooted thinkers. That's not what we want out of a university. There's already been a very real threat in recent years to transform liberal arts for more insidious purposes, to convert history, for example, into an instrument to legitimize a certain Hindutva-aligned version of the past, or transform political science, or as some would call it, entire political science, into lessons on chauvinistic nationalism, or even transforming a supposedly obsolete English literature into communicative global language skills for prospective call center employees. That, frankly, is not what I'm talking about. Those exercises will not culminate in an expansion of the intellect, but would constitute a travesty. Because we must always in education, higher education, have room for the imaginative, the ruminative, the philosophical, and the theoretical as well. And there's no question, for example, that here in Kerala, it's very important we fight to preserve academic freedom. In some places in northern India, that's been abridged, it's been challenged. Some are trying to establish an exclusionary and linear worldview, or to entrench narrow-minded chauvinistic dogmas on our campuses. And that will have a vitiating impact on our democratic society. We in Kerala have a robust functioning civil society, university system, and a functioning democracy. We challenge our rulers, and so we should, they deserve it. We also challenge ourselves, and that's something we must be able to continue to do. If we were to look at the future of universities in India today, in the globalized world in which we live, in the diverse democracy that we all want to protect, our students are increasingly likely to be surrounded by others who do not necessarily subscribe to their point of view, may not share the same sets of beliefs and convictions, or even the same sets of cultural practices, culinary preferences, or customs. I have always been in favor of an approach of liberal cosmopolitanism on university campuses. We need to look beyond our differences. We need to celebrate and embrace our differences rather than regarding our diversity as a problem to be contained. And that's something that's extremely essential. Equally, we have to counteract the growing deficit in our country of individuals who fail to see that people of other religions, other castes, other language groups, other nationalities are ultimately sharing the same dreams as all of us, the same fears, the same hopes. And for that, we need that our universities to remain as free and open spaces where dissent and multiple worldviews are welcome and cherished for their own complexity and diversity. To my mind, alternative worldviews and convictions have to be encouraged. If a university doesn't do that, if a university tries to impose one narrow view, it will be failing our society. So, the idea of a university which combines teaching and research and develops the general powers of the mind, as Newman wanted, as well as giving specialized training, has three possible fates. One is, of course, that we can take this to a mass higher education system. You know, our government has an ambition that we should have a gross enrollment ratio of 50%. You know what a gross enrollment ratio is, right? That's the percentage of students enrolled at a particular level of education in relation to the population at that age. So in India, primary education, after the Right to Education Act, we actually have 100%, in some cases 103, 104% GER, gross enrollment rate, because we've managed to catch all the kids who are not in school and put them into school. By the time you get to class 5, the dropouts start. By class 8, the gross enrollment rate is about 68%. By class 10, it's down below 50%, and those who graduate are about 38, 40%. Today in universities, our gross enrollment ratio has gone up from where it was when I was a minister, but it's gone up only to 23%. So in other words, of all those of the age group to go to university, only 23% are in university today. What the government wants is to take it up to 50%. That's the ambition. But the fact is that creating a mass education system of that nature will call for far more resources than this government so far has been prepared to commit. The percentage of money that's going into, as a GDP, that's going into higher education needs to be dramatically improved. Since the days of the Kothari Commission in the 1960s, we're saying we need to have 6% of GDP devoted to education. We're not even at 3%. We're well below that at the moment. Then, the second possible fate is a completely utilitarian and managerial direction where every university just produces people for jobs. And that will essentially be a sort of polytechnic approach to education rather than truly university approach to education. And the third is an acceptance that universities have different missions, that you can interpret the idea of a university in different ways. You have your research institutions, you have your teaching institutions, you have embracing of differences even at the level of conceptualizing universities. You can have some that are devoted to the disinterested pursuit of knowledge, philosophy, and so on. Why not? That's also part of what you want as an ideal society. But at the same time, rather than seeing the idea of a university as a fixed set of immutable characteristics, we need to see a set of permanently present tensions which can be resolved differently according to time and place. And to my mind, this doesn't often work with the high privatization and market fees that we are seeing in a number of high quality institutions that are responding to this challenge, but which are completely in the private sector. There are 4 or 5 that have come up, particularly in the vicinity of Delhi. Many of you heard their names: O.P. Jindal, Shiv Nadar University, Ashoka University. These are universities that are producing, in many ways, a world-class standard of liberal education in their campuses. But they're charging fees that 99% of Indian families cannot afford. And so what I've urged all of them to do is to be generous in scholarships, that they must have access to people from that 99%, rather than become oases of privilege that unfortunately is the immediate consequence of the privatization of higher education. And we do need absolutely to ensure that the marginalized and the excluded are benefiting from this kind of high quality education as well. Now, I need to try and bring this to a conclusion. We need to be far-sighted enough to recognize that at its core in a democratic society, our universities must evolve into spaces where an ideal version of democracy itself is allowed to thrive. In other words, our universities must become the staging ground for experiments in developing the most principled version of our democratic ethos, and by extension, a microcosm of what our democratic society could be one day. We are not anywhere near the democratic ideal, even if our Prime Minister says we are the mother of democracy. This is a mother who has urgent need of medical attention, unfortunately. But the truth is that we must obviously give that attention to our mother, to our democracy, to our society. And I would say that taking stock of the barriers to access and inclusion that permeate all levels of our society, recognizing that, for example, during the pandemic, there was a shift to online classes, but what about all those who didn't have access to good online devices, did not have access at all in some cases in some poor families, even to a mobile phone? What happens to those people? Whether we are looking at the e-education boom, billions of dollars being poured into e-education, or we're looking at the old-fashioned campus structure, I'm convinced after the experience of the pandemic that e-learning can only at best be a complement to classroom learning. It can never replace or substitute for the classroom and for the teacher. And I think those who think that they can do it as a supplement, the way in which some students go off and get extra tuition, that's fine. But never encourage anyone to think that we can shift the classrooms online, because not only are they missing out on the true interactions with teachers, not only are they missing out the ability to raise a hand and challenge a teacher in the middle of an argument, they're also losing the great benefit of on-campus interaction. All of you know at bottom that when you leave college, when you leave university, you will have learned as much from your fellow classmates as you have learned from your teachers. So let's not even get too carried away by all this e-learning and e-education idea. To my mind, if we can integrate various kinds of approaches, some of the conventional teaching, some of the opportunities to actually benefit from the great minds on our faculties, some of the opportunities to just learn by arguing with each other as students, and at the same time complementing where feasible, where necessary, where useful, with online or massive online courses and so on. If we can have a composite approach, we can take India forward. I do believe that many of the elements in the new education policy that the government is trying to push are not bad. I personally welcome the flexibility to take courses in unrelated subjects, which we didn't have in my time. I'd love it if somebody was able to do a degree in biology and also study literature as a subsidiary subject, why not? And I think that as we see the evolution of the policy in practice, it'll be very good. But the key issue still remains resources, putting resources into the universities to ensure that there is enough to offer high quality in all these areas. With these words, I want to once again congratulate the University of Kerala on the Researchers' Fest. I'm particularly pleased with what I saw myself while touring the research gallery. And I want to say to all of you, I hope that you will find in your educational opportunities here tremendous possibilities for not only expanding your own minds, cultivating your own intellect in that classic phrase, but also being able to contribute to the growth, well-being, and the social justice in our democratic society. Thank you very much, and Jai Hind.